So the event this evening is Maryland Politics 2018. Can Larry Hogan withhold or withstand the blue wave? I'm thrilled to introduce the two guests who have come here to share their expertise with us. We have Bryan Sears from the Daily Record in Annapolis, Maryland Politics reporter. We have Mileah Kromer, the director of the Goucher poll at Goucher College. I don't think we could ask for two better people to be here talking about Maryland Politics 2018. And then I'll do my part.
Well, certainly not for what you're paying.
Yeah, yeah, well, the pay is great, but the view is wonderful, so at least you've got that going. And I will add whenever I can. My thinking is we spend a little bit of time just talking about history, background, trying to put this election in context. For those of you who do not follow Maryland politics, this election is a very, very strange election in Maryland because we have an incumbent Republican governor. That in and of itself is strange in Maryland. We have an incumbent Republican governor who seems poised for a pretty comfortable re-election. That hasn't happened in Maryland since the 1950s. So with everything that's happening nationally, which seems to favor Democrats, we've got this sort of strange dynamic going on in Maryland that I thought would be worth speaking about. I've asked Bryan to talk a bit about Larry Hogan in Annapolis, how he works with the legislature, how he's worked with the leadership of an overwhelmingly Democratic assembly. I've asked Mileah to talk a bit about the polling information on Larry Hogan. He happens to be right now the second most popular governor in the United States. You know, when did that appear? When did this strength sort of come to be? And where is the sort of status of the race? And what I'm going to do to get us started off is just give you a little bit of a foundation, a background on Maryland politics. And because I am a professor, I of course brought a PowerPoint presentation just to put some of it in perspective. But I won't use it very much. Let me just enlarge this thing here. The first thing you've got to know about Maryland politics is most people outside of the state of Maryland, and quite a lot of people from within Maryland, think that this is a very boring state to study. They're convinced it's just a blue state, Democrats always win, why on earth would you want to pay any attention to it? And from the outside, this sort of makes sense. We know that Democrats have a 2-to-1 voter registration advantage. Democrats have held every statewide office with regard to the U.S. Senate since the 1980s, and with the exception of Bob Eberly and Larry Hogan, have held the governor's office pretty consistently since the 1960s. Win the comptroller's race, win the attorney general's race. It appears to be a Democratic state. But things have been changing in this state over the course of the past couple of decades. Forgive how blurred it is on the side here, but Maryland, which is now a 2-to-1 Democratic state, used to be a 3-to-1 Democratic state. Democrats used to claim 70% of all registered voters in the state. Over the course of the past couple of decades, Democrats have seen that advantage shrink from 70% to its current level, which is today 55%. Now what's fascinating is, even as Democrats have seen their numbers go from 70% down to 55%, the share of Republicans in the state hasn't increased. Republicans have been at about 25-26% of registered voters for the better part of the last 4 decades. So where is all the action? All the action is among unaffiliated voters. That's where the growth has been in the state of Maryland. Well, it matters because those unaffiliated voters tend to be more willing to vote Republican than traditionally Democrats have been. And this has added to a bit of competition in the state. Where we've really seen this competition come into play in the state of Maryland has been in those counties outside of the I-95 corridor. So Western Maryland has become a very reliably Republican area. The Eastern Shore has become increasingly Republican, and so has Southern Maryland, with the exception of Charles County. So Calvert and St. Mary's County have become more Republican. Charles County has become a bit of a suburb or a bedroom community, if you will, for Prince George's County. It's becoming more Democratic. Northern Maryland, above Baltimore County, has become more Republican as well. So you're seeing these changes taking place that in many respects reflect what we're seeing nationally. An urban-suburban divide, really an urban-rural divide in Maryland, where it's Republican in the rural areas and Democratic in the urban areas, and the suburbs become battlegrounds. One of the ways in which Larry Hogan was able to win 4 years ago, it wasn't just because Anthony Brown ran a poor campaign, which I think most people would argue he did. It was a somewhat lackluster an uninspiring campaign. But there was a sense that the Democratic Party's coalition, which had long been a big tent Democratic Party, home to conservatives, moderates, and liberals, had become a much more progressive party. Under Martin O'Malley, who was the governor at the time, who wanted to be president, he had really pushed the party in the direction of the National Democratic Party. And many Democrats who had continued to vote for the party really didn't feel comfortable with it anymore, and they voted Republican. And Larry Hogan didn't do any better than prior Republicans in the core Democratic areas of PG County, Baltimore City, or Montgomery. What Larry Hogan did was he really ran the numbers up in all of those areas outside of I-95 and did well in Baltimore County and Howard County. And because of that, he didn't need to do any better in Prince George's, Baltimore City, or Montgomery. This is not something that had been the case in the past in Maryland. But it's because if you look at where the population is growing in Maryland, it's growing in those areas that are becoming somewhat more Republican. It allows a Republican to have this opportunity. Now that got him in office. He has to actually win re-election to continue in office, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. I want to turn this off and then turn it over to our guests to talk a little bit about how Governor Hogan operated in Annapolis after winning, and then also what the polls started to show about the governor after he won election. So let me turn this sort of obnoxious thing off behind us.
It's good lighting though.
All right. So please, Bryan, tell us about Governor Hogan and what he did in Annapolis after winning.
Well, I think what we saw the governor do was pretty much govern in a lot of ways the way that he said he was going to, and he has, for the most part, been what I think most of us would describe as a moderate. There have not been a lot of major policy issues that the Democrats have really wanted that they couldn't get done, either because he has either agreed with them, in some cases outright adopted their ideas. For example, the ban on fracking probably doesn't get done if Larry Hogan doesn't come out and basically announce that he's in favor of a fracking ban and sort of force the legislature's hand when they were really looking to do something that would have put the issue on the ballot. He has shown himself to be very disciplined. That was something we saw all along during the campaign. He stays on message in a way that is pretty uncommon. He has found a way to torment the opposition party, I think, when he finds it appropriate. For example, the debate over overpaid sick leave. There was a lot of consternation among lawmakers who supported this when Hogan came out in December before the session where it was passed and essentially proposed his own idea, which was somewhat less than what they wanted, which immediately, to most of us who were watching, we saw that as the governor's setting the table for a moment where he knew that his proposal would never pass, but he could then veto the bill that ultimately would be sent to him and simultaneously say, I'm for it, but also against this. So he has been able to find those niches, and then on top of it, he has used social media both during the campaign, the first campaign, and his time in office, in a way that really has caught Democratic legislators a little flat-footed. And he has discovered he has this large megaphone, and he uses it. And there are a lot of times where it really irritates the folks in the legislature to the point where they will bring it up and respond to it on the floor during floor sessions.
And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but to this day, neither the President of the Senate, Mike Miller, or the Speaker of the House, Mike Bush, make much use of social media at all. They're on Twitter. They're on Facebook.
They're on Facebook. The President of the Senate, I discovered, friended me on Facebook a couple of years ago, and I thought for sure it was a staffer and was told no, in fact, it was the Senate President. But they don't use it in the same way. And I'm not sure that there is a sort of a large understanding of exactly how to leverage it in the way that the governor does. It's not always clear to me which posts are driven by the governor and which are some of his staff. He has very good staff up there, starting with Hannah Marr, who came in with him from the campaign and really understood how to use social media. I am told, though, that when you engage on his official Facebook page and the governor responds, I'm told that almost always that's the governor responding.
Okay. Well, and just to put in a plug that is a nonpartisan plug, I would like to point out that several of the people who are working Governor Hogan's media strategy are alums of St. Mary's College. So we've got quite a lot of folks who have gone to Annapolis and are having an influence, a very real influence, on state politics every day, and that just happens to be one of them. So he's been very smart in that use of social media.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I think that's really helped him sort of maintain. In a lot of ways, he's used it to humanize himself. He used it to communicate with the public when he was going through his battle with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He's really made a maximum amount of use in a way that we haven't seen elected officials do before. I mean, Martin O'Malley was really known for his use of Twitter, but this was something a little more sophisticated than that.
Well, of course, Hogan started using social media before he ever even ran for governor with the Change Maryland organization. So he was out there on social media setting the stage for all of this.
Correct.
Although, they might tell you, we weren't necessarily setting the stage for this. We didn't know if we would run. You got to assume they knew that they were planning to run, and they had really set the stage for that brilliantly on social media.
I think a lot of us understood that was he started that 4 years in advance. We understood that was a 4-year campaign for governor, and almost immediately after being sworn in, it turned into a 4-year campaign to get reelected. And I don't think that any of us operated with any other idea that that's what it was.
Okay, great. And the point about taking some of the Democrats' ideas, for those of you who are younger and did not live through the Clinton years, this is, of course, something that President Bill Clinton was famous for. He had won the presidency. Within 2 years, Democrats lost the Congress, Republicans won. Republicans assumed this meant certainly Bill Clinton was a one-term president, but Bill Clinton very wisely started taking Republican ideas, claiming them as his own, the popular ones, and running on them. And it was a winning strategy for him to win re-election. Republicans hated it.
We're seeing it right now with the campaign. By the way, Democratic lawmakers have been doing this for years to Republicans who will put in bills and labor over bills for years, and just as they sort of become ripe, they end up getting a Democratic sponsor and being passed. So this happens in Annapolis a lot, but you're seeing this play out now in the current election with the governor running ads talking about the Hogan lockbox for education. This bill is only vaguely like the proposal that he put out, which was more statutory rather than written into the Constitution. But the bill that ultimately will be on the ballot and if it passes, change the state constitution, he has now adopted it and unabashedly refers to it as the Hogan lockbox in his ads.
I've seen the ads. And for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, this would take basically the casino, the table game, the slot machine revenue that was supposed to go to education in addition to what we were already giving. Instead went to education, and then they took money that they used to spend and spent it elsewhere. This would enshrine in the Constitution that money must go to education, and you must continue funding education with additional funds. That's the lockbox.
Correct.
All right, so that's the background there. Great. Well, can you tell us a little bit then, Mileah, about the polls and when the polls first started to indicate that, yeah, he might have won with 52% of the vote, but this is someone who's got the potential to be a second termer.
Right, so we've been tracking gubernatorial approval rating since 2012. So obviously we had the last few years of the O'Malley administration, and then we started again with the Hogan administration. It's been really consistent, and I think that's been the most remarkable thing about his public opinion. So the first time we measured it, he was really like a ton of don't knows. It was exactly what you would expect, particularly for a Republican governor of a blue state who won in like sort of a sleepy election in 2014. Not a lot of turnout. So people were still unsure in February. By the time we checked back in with him that following September, it had bumped up significantly. It was up, I think, by that point in time, around 65%, which was incredibly good for any governor, regardless of your party affiliation, and then it was especially good for a governor who did not share the party affiliation of the majority of the state. It has been unwavering since, and I think that has been the persistent sort of irritant of the Democratic Party in this state. that no matter what they seem to do, they've not been able to budget. So, they've, even, especially post 2016, they thought for sure, well, this will be able to do it. So the Trump's election would make Larry Hogan guilty by party affiliation. Just the association, the Republican label would pull him down. It hasn't budged it. And that is because of the things that Bryan, spoke about, is that he's been able to find policy issues that are generally popular across the electorate, and then champion those issues. And he's also been able to, I think for the biggest thing, is he recognized early on that Marylanders cared about taxes. They didn't want any additional tax burdens. They wanted fee relief. They wanted some sort of money back in their pockets. And that is the issue that got him elected, and it's the issue that he has stayed on message because in part by the really excellent staff that you're talking about, stayed on message throughout his entire time. So at the underneath it all, he was the one who can now say that he did not raise taxes during his time in office, which was a difference between him and the previous administration. And that central tax message, the message that resonates the most, that the Marylanders, our polls suggest that economic issues and taxes they care about the most, that issue has, I think, buoyed his popularity across the entire time in office, and frankly, people like him. And so it also doesn't hurt that he's gregarious, that I think Bryan and I talked about this one day about no selfie has been left untaken with the governor. If you run into him at a fair or if anybody sees him during early voting or election day, if you ask him for a selfie, he will give you a selfie and a handshake, and that sort of politician who is a natural extrovert and who enjoys interacting with the public and who does it so well and then amplifies that message then through social media, plus a $9 million campaign fund that can additionally amplify that message through campaign advertisements. It's really no wonder that he's in this sort of electoral position he's in right now.
He's built this brand as sort of this regular guy, and I've talked to some folks leading up to the election, and especially people who tell me that they're lifelong Democrats who haven't voted Republican and are this time going to vote for Larry Hogan. And inevitably, when I ask the question why, the first words out of their mouth are, I like him. And it's always sort of a variation of that theme is I like him, and then comes the, and he hasn't really done anything wrong. I mean, but it always starts with this level of personal popularity where they see him as a regular guy. I had one person I talked to that said, he seems like a guy I'd have a beer with.
Okay. So for a while, anyway, Democrats were convinced that his approval rating had gone up because of the cancer.
Sure.
And that eventually that rating would go down again.
What
do you think about that as somebody who measures public opinion?
No, it never happened. Listen, I always say this. I mean, anybody who has a family member who's ever been sick with cancer knows that cancer is not an advantage in any situation ever. It doesn't matter where you are or who you are. It's a disadvantage, period. What resonated about the governor's battle with cancer is not that he was sick, but the way in which he publicly shared it. People appreciated, I think, his being forthright about it, and appreciated seeing a public official struggle with an issue that affects families across the state. And so I think it certainly raised his public, I think it probably raised the amount of attention individuals paid to the governor, particularly in the first term, just because of the public battle. But the public also has a short memory. And so while, yes, I think there might have been attention paid and people appreciated the way he publicly struggled with it, after that, people go back to their everyday lives, and it's still the economy that underlies everything. It was rolling back the taxes. It was telling the public and working in a bipartisan manner. Those are the types of things that have sustained his approval ratings. So I think it's really incomplete, and it really makes me cringe when I hear people say that, oh, it's just because of the cancer. That is completely wrong to say that. There's no way he would have been able to sustain these approval ratings if not for other things that the public really liked.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the Republican brand, which is not that great right now for obvious reasons. You've got a president who's pretty divisive. Democrats especially do not like him. We are a state that's 2-1 Democratic. Talk about the state of affairs for Donald Trump in Maryland.
I will give you a quick, so when you say Democrats don't like him, that's an understatement. Democrats in this state, last time we measured, it was something like 90% of Democrats in the state disapproved of the job the president was doing. On the other hand, just as that comparison, around 55 to 60-ish% of Democrats that approved of the way Larry Hogan was handling his job as governor. So you can see that they look at the governor and the president through completely different lenses. And so that's, I think, is important. I think they have a mirror sort of image of each other.
And it's important to mention in that same vein, there has been this attempt from the day after Donald Trump was elected to link Larry Hogan as closely to Donald Trump as they possibly could. And so far, it doesn't seem to have stuck at all. Hogan has been very clear about the fact he didn't vote for Donald Trump. He has at times publicly disagreed with the president, although perhaps not as much as some of his friends in the Democratic Party wish he would. But he seems to have found this lane in which he is critical of the president and avoids getting involved in sort of the stuff that goes on in Washington, and doesn't seem to sort of upset his base. And Democrats look at it and believe that he has done enough to disagree with someone that they vehemently disagree with.
And I actually think that's the most important part that the most interesting part about the whole Trump phenomena is not necessarily the Democrats have not been able to sort of tie the two together, but how unshakable the Republican base has been behind Larry Hogan. So I think the Maryland Republican Party very much is the party of Hogan more than the party of Trump. They're more closely identified. And so although the governor has certainly and publicly distanced himself from the president, there has been no indication in any of our polls that his base has turned their back on him. I can remember reading one story, and this was about the Justice Taney statue when it was taken down from the State House grounds after post-Charlottesville. There was some I think anecdotal evidence on Facebook that his base was mad. We were in the field shortly after that, unshakable. So, and especially now that Democrats had nominated, in June, a really progressive a really progressive gubernatorial candidate. Ben Jealous. So the Republicans, when they're asked to pick, it's either vote for our guy or you get this guy, which is, I think, diametrically opposed to a lot of the conservative ideology, certainly.
Which creates another interesting dynamic about Maryland as opposed to a lot of other states that we've seen over the course of the last 2 years since Trump won. In red states, in Republican states, if you went against Donald Trump, it typically ended your political career. You were not going to win re-election. You were primaried, and the candidate that Trump preferred wound up winning in the primary. But in Maryland, which is of course not a red state, it's a blue state, a Democratic state, breaking with Trump has actually proven to be a successful strategy for a Republican, and not just for Trump, but for Governor Baker in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. And it probably comes down to the fact that if you're a Republican in Maryland, your alternative is not a more conservative Republican than Larry Hogan. Your option is going to be a progressive Democrat.
And really, making a mistake, it's also because a lot of Republicans in the state really like the governor. So the affinity that may perhaps is shared across the board, maybe with some Democrats and independents who say they like him personally, I think that there is a really deep-seated affinity that they really like the governor. That's, again, I think in the state, it's much more the party of Hogan than it is of Trump.
Well then, speak a little bit, either one of you, if you're comfortable. He is the governor, he is popular, he is likely to be reelected. Has that translated into popularity for the Republican Party in Maryland, where Democrats still do dominate? They hold all but one of the congressional seats, both of the Senate seats, and they have supermajorities in the House and the Senate and the General Assembly.
I think it's probably a mixed bag. I mean, a lot of the legislative on the legislative side, a lot of it is driven by the districts that have been drawn. There is a certain amount of gerrymandering that has gone on, even in the state legislature, where you have districts that are drawn to protect Democratic members. I always point to the 42nd district up in Baltimore County, which has a single member district solely for the purpose of protecting a Democratic member in an otherwise Republican leaning seat. I think it's a more complicated story to tell, because this is the Republican Party that has elected Pat McDonough out of Harford County, who has certainly aligned himself with the president.
Right, very conservative member.
Very conservative and very bombastic, and somebody who ran for Baltimore County executive, and the governor actually endorsed a more moderate Republican. The governor has also taken it upon himself at times to challenge members of his own party, including down here in St. Mary's County, where he actively went and recruited someone to run against a first-term incumbent because of differences on some issues. And so I don't know that it is necessarily translated into this wide rebranding of the Republican Party. But a second Hogan term with the ability to redistrict could change a little bit of the map. You could perhaps see some more Republicans in the state legislature. But again, depending on how those districts are drawn, you're going to have Republicans that are going to be anywhere from sort of very moderate flavored Republicans to Pat McDonough.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is it is a clearly Democratic majority state. So even if you eliminate the redistricting that has been done to maximize the Democratic advantage, you're never going to create a situation where Republicans are on par with Democrats, because the registration numbers just aren't there. And the registration numbers haven't increased as a percent. That still has remained flat.
I think you're more likely to see see a Green Party candidate elected out of some place like Montgomery County or Prince George's County than you will to see a Republican sent back to the legislature from that
Democratic
area.
areas in the state and big population centers.
So the question really is about the Hogan coattail. So that's certainly, that's certainly what you see in the big drive for 5 districts in the state Senate, hoping to flip the Senate, not flip the Senate, but break apart the Democratic veto-proof majority they have in the state Senate. So Republicans have targeted these 5 different districts across the state, and the hopes are that this really popular incumbent governor would be able to sort of bring them along. But what Larry Hogan has really done, though, in order to buoy his popularity, he has had to make his brand sort of separate from a more toxic Republican brand nationwide, particularly here in the state. Again, we talk about the demographics, and frankly, Donald Trump has made Republican politics really divisive and toxic for Democrats here in the state. And so by separating himself, by making himself an independent brand, the question is, does it actually cut off then his coattails, or the full sort of strength of his coattails? We asked about this specifically in our last poll back in September, and it's a mixed bag. So having the Hogan brand next to your name helps, particularly among Republicans. Republicans like to see you being endorsed by the governor. For Democrats, it's a little bit mixed. They really don't care that much. They're more likely to say, we don't care if the governor endorsed the person or not. So.
Okay. I can pause for a moment. If anybody has any questions, it'd be a great time. If you've got a question, I'm happy to try to answer them. Yeah, please.
Yeah, just to preface comments so I'm not misunderstood. I'm a lifelong Democrat. I've served as a county commissioner in Charles County. And volunteered for Robert Kennedy in 1968. But in my opinion, watching politics for half a century, Hogan has run the most brilliant campaign probably in Maryland history, given the dynamics of the electorate that you all have analyzed so well. Jealous has run probably the worst gubernatorial campaign in my lifetime. Now, I'm not going to tell you how I'm going to vote, which I'm going to do when I leave here. But and I haven't endorsed the Democratic nominee. But I think the question that is on my mind is, will demographics triumph over analytical issues and competence in managing a campaign? Because we've all lived through 2016. We know how unpredictable these things are and how unpredictable the electorate is. And being in Charles County, I have in my own career seen a seismic shift in the demographics there. In fact, we're in these final few days on a Senate seat in Charles County where we have an unpopular Democratic nominee for the Senate, and we have the governor actively campaigning for a rival and organizing major events and recruiting lifelong Democrats that I've worked with my whole career to stand with him in photo ops. So we have a very dynamic situation here, and I'd like your thoughts on whether demographics will triumph over competence, or whether competence will be the key factor in this outcome.
Look, I think that's why we play the game. I mean, in the end, I mean, this is a unique election. So I go back to covering state elections. Let's say 2002 was my first true. I'm responsible for the gubernatorial election. This one feels different in a lot of ways. It's not just the increase in the number of registered voters that we're seeing, or the talk about a blue wave, or even some of the numbers that I think suggest in some of the polls that you're going to see, more Democrats come out and vote, but also more willing to split tickets and vote for Larry Hogan and other Democrats down the ballot. I think some of this is one of those questions that we may not know the answer to until we get to the end of the election. I think the race you're talking about is the former Mac Middleton seat. That's one of those sleeper seats that I think a lot of us are watching, because I've had a number of Republicans who have come up and talked to me about the possibility that maybe there's an opportunity to snatch a seat there, and I find it sort of hard to believe, but I can't also fully discount it, and it's one of those places. It's one of those places I'll be watching.
So I'll answer this, at least in the terms of how it feels to be a pollster. So listen, our poll found that Hogan is up significantly. Other polls have found the sort of same result. And there is the worry, there is certainly, I think, the worry among the Hogan campaign that the individuals might tell a pollster over the phone in a snapshot in time back in September, sure, although we're Democrats, we're going to vote for Larry Hogan. I think the worry always is that when it comes down to that final decision in the ballot box, that party identification, that partisans come home, and they look at that ballot and they had intentions of voting for Larry Hogan, and then they got at the end, whatever happened, Donald Trump tweeted something or something, they were reminded of something terrible in the news that day that Republicans did, and that brand is just too much for them to overcome, and they make those sort of last minute decisions. That is something I'm sure that keeps the campaign up at night, right? But in their defense, when you talk about their really well-run campaign, I agree. And $9 million buys you a lot of advertisements, and it buys you a lot of individuals who stand at each one of these polling centers. They hand out literature and talk to voters at that last possible minute. It buys television advertisements, it buys mailers, it buys touch points. And that constant reminder of if you look at the Hogan sort of advertisement campaign, it's all about the ones that get targeted to Democrats, and I'm sure you've received these at your house, that he's independent, he's bipartisan, he's willing to work across party lines. And that is the final reminder that the Hogan campaign wants to give to voters, particularly Democratic voters, in those waning weeks, in those last few days. He has the fundamentals to be able to do it, but I think there's certainly for the Hogan people, there is that sort of back of your mind concern. Will they act in the time of Trump? Will they actually pull the lever for me? I guess we don't pull levers and touch the screen or check the box, color in the box, whatever the thing may be.
But there's one other thing that I guess we haven't mentioned, and it's only because it seems to be being talked about recently, which is, since the Kavanaugh hearings, there is some suggestion that Republican voters are becoming hyper-motivated now too. And we're seeing discussions from Democratic pollsters that are saying that they're seeing this now more in some of the late polling that they're doing, and how much that really carries over in Maryland, I think remains to be seen. But I don't think that you can completely discount it. And again, it's one of those things that makes this election cycle kind of an odd election cycle.
Well, I mean, it's worth considering. Routinely in Maryland, Republican turnout is better than Democratic turnout. It's just there are so few Republicans comparatively that it doesn't matter, but their turnout tends to be stronger. I'm glad you mentioned Charles County, because, of course, the Middleton seat really highlights a lot of what happened in the Democratic primary this time around. And in the Democratic primary, there was clear evidence of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party coming out en masse and really pushing back against the Democratic Party establishment. And we saw it not only in Charles County with the completely unexpected defeat of Middleton, but also with some folks in Baltimore and in a few other places, long-standing members who lost their seat to progressive upstarts. The issue that created then, though, was for many in the Democratic Party who have been Democrats for a very long time, even though they may be more moderate or conservative than the National Party, this then caused them to look at the Democratic Party in Maryland and ask, is this still my Democratic Party? Hogan has benefited from that. So you've got a few cross currents that are working here that we don't quite know how they're going to play out. Will Democrats ultimately come home? Or will they feel that in Maryland they've got to send a message to the Democratic Party that we've always been a big tent, we've got to stay a big tent? And if that's the case, they're not going to necessarily go along with the progressive insurgency that we saw in the primary. But then what we see in the polls, of course, is, you're right, it's anywhere from 30 to 38% of Democrats are saying they intend to vote for Larry Hogan. Hogan won, I think the estimate is about 24-25% of Democrats in 2014, and that was enough to win. If he's winning anywhere near 30%, he wins. I mean, it's virtually impossible for him not to win. I've run these numbers sort of every way from Thursday, assuming that the electorate is 57% Democrat, assuming that the electorate is 61% Democrat. I mean, we're talking really good Democratic years. If Hogan is at 30% or better of the Democratic vote, he wins. So the challenge for Ben Jealous, the Democratic nominee, of course, is convince those Democrats to come home. And we haven't had a poll, I guess, in a week and a half or 2 weeks now.
No, it's killing me.
And the one consistent thing that had shown up, though, in all the polls, they all consistently show this race is about averaging out to about 18 points. Any other time, 18 points, game over, the election's done. This is Maryland, where Democrats dominate. We've got a very unpopular president who's incredibly unpopular here. The Hogan folks in no way are taking for granted that they've got an 18-point lead. And I don't think anybody would be wise to assume that on election day it's going to be an 18-point
Well, they
race.
shouldn't. I mean, they shouldn't, and
Right.
and you haven't seen them really, ginning that up and saying, hey, look how far ahead we are. Because the worst thing in the world that you want to do is to sort of really instill in people's minds that in Maryland you are 18 to 20 points up, because people then might start get the idea that, hey, look, he's got this.
I'm gonna stay home.
It's raining today. I don't need to go out. He's got it.
Yeah, I think the other dynamic, though, in this, though, we've got to talk about is his challenger, Ben Jealous. Jealous ran an incredibly effective campaign in that primary. He understood that he had to motivate the progressive base of the party. He worked quite effectively with labor to get those folks to the polls. He won, and then it just seemed to disappear.
So there's a couple of things, and so the Jealous campaign is always quick to point out that nobody predicted his primary victory, that he ended up winning by 10 points, but all the polls indicated that him and Rashawn Baker were really tied sort of head to head. The part of that story that is always forgotten is the 30% of Democrats in which they were undecided in the week or two sort of leading up to that race. And so,
And of course, a major candidate died, which threw upheaval into the race.
it was really sort of really fluid sort of election. At the same time, an election that not a lot of Democrats were frankly paying that much attention to. When you have that large percentage of Democrats not paying attention to their primary in supposedly a blue wave year, I mean that's problematic. But the point that never gets really talked about is, like, in those waning weeks, about $1 million of outside spending was infused into the state to sort of push him over the finish line, to take those undecided voters and convert them into Jealous voters. Now, progressives are really motivated, but the question is, what does the electorate in Maryland look like? It's the whole back to the middle temperament argument, right? So yes, progressives make up around 30 to even 40%, depending on how you measure it, parts of the electorate. But that leaves a large chunk that are the plurality being moderates and then the rest being conservatives. And if you're a conservative, you're not jumping to vote for Jealous. You're gonna vote for Larry Hogan. And those moderates are breaking heavily right now for the governor. And that's his strength. That's why you hear I'm a moderate pragmatist. I'm independent from the party over and over and over again, because he's banking on he's banking on that being the ideological makeup of the Maryland electorate, which all of our polls suggest that it certainly is.
Well, I think that the Jealous folks were convinced that The reason Brown lost was because low turnout in 2014, Democrats stayed home. And that they didn't need to win any Hogan Democrats back, they just needed to turn out the folks that didn't turn out in 2014. That was a risky strategy, because if you're not trying to convert Democrats back to you, you're totally relying on people who are less reliable voters. The good money is always on the people who vote and vote reliably, but that's the game they played. That was their strategy. We're going to focus on the folks who didn't vote.
And keep in mind, though, he might be right.
He
so
might
that,
be.
So I
Absolutely.
think that's important to say that there's a lifetime, 2 weeks is a lifetime in politics. He might be right. We're finally seeing some cash infusion from the Democratic Governors Association. They just are starting to put out an ad. He might be right. But you're right. It was a gamble.
It was a gamble.
Sorry, and you were going to talk, and I interrupted you.
No, and one of the things I was going to mention is that six out of every 10 voters in the Democratic primary voted for somebody else not named Ben Jealous. Ben Jealous finished with about 40% of the vote. And what we've seen pretty consistently in the polling is somewhere between 36 and 38%. He's never breaking that 40% ceiling. And so the first question, I sort of speak about the questions that I have when I look at these numbers. And so the first question I have is, when we look at these numbers, is this the hardcore progressive side of the party that is going, and the hardcore Democrats who are going to vote for the Democratic champion no matter what? They've made it clear in some ways that they're not interested in recruiting back the moderates that have made up this Larry Hogan coalition of Republicans and moderate independents and moderate Democrats. And so you're seeing that, you're starting to see that number sort of stagnate a little bit, and I'm not seeing that line move. The other thing that didn't happen after the primary was he didn't raise any money. This is a guy who was in a blue state, became the Democratic champion and was getting out fundraised by the Republican, and then watched immediately after winning the primary, watched the Republican Governors Association come in and literally win the air war against Ben Jealous, running these ads that were clearly defining him. Jealous had no money to respond. They were dismissive. There were a number of times when we would talk and they'd say, well, nobody's paying attention. They won't start paying attention until after Labor Day. And, but what happened was you saw, and I wrote a story about this. One of the things that we saw in the polling is that Larry Hogan is doing well with women. He made this an issue. We know that women are decision makers and financial decision makers in the household. The RGA is running these ads and programs that are largely made up in terms of the demographic viewership of women. We talked about this when I wrote the story, and you told me, you said, I haven't seen any of these ads, but my wife says she sees them all the time. And I think the quote that I used, you said, my wife and I watch very different television programs.
And we do, and she was seeing his ads constantly, and I was not seeing them ever.
And we're seeing, we're seeing these numbers where he's doing well with women voters, and that's important for Republicans because they lost women voters since 2014 and have had a hard time getting them out. But he's turning this into a pocketbook election again. I think that in the end, I think the Jealous campaign would like to say, look, money doesn't matter. We're going to grassroots this. But you still need money for a ground game. Somebody's getting paid somewhere to do sort of to do the organizing. And I think in the end, the governor really capitalized on that fundraising advantage.
Okay.
He just wasn't the only, and so Ben Jealous ended up also not being the only sort of progressive Bernie Sanders guy in town either. So you look nationally, there's been a ton of progressive money. It just isn't going here. It's going to Florida and it's going to Georgia. And the key difference between those races and our race here is that Larry Hogan has run as an un-Trump Republican, and the two individuals in which Stacey Abrams and Andrew Gillum are running against in Georgia and Florida respectively are very much aligned with President Donald Trump. And those are two states, one, Florida, which is always a key swing state. Democrats would very much like to be in the governor's mansion for 2020. And then Georgia, which at one point in time, I think in 2012, people were actually talking about being the new blue state of the South. And so Maryland when we look at it nationally, like as much as important as we think it is, nationally, taking out an un-Trump Republican in Maryland, it's reliably blue for presidential elections, isn't really that much of a priority to progressive groups sort of nationwide.
And there's
Right, and
one-
I think the Democratic Governors Association, I believe they're putting about 250,000 in. The Republican Governors Association has already spent 4 million here. 250,000 in the final couple of weeks is not much money.
And it doesn't get you on TV in the DC market.
No, you almost get the sense that the Democratic Governors Association is taking the gamble that, well, if the blue wave does elect him, we want to be able to claim credit.
And-
So let's spend some money in the state so it looks good for us.
And to be clear, this group that's running the ads is not, according to Hoyle, the Democratic Governors Association. It is an affiliate group of the Democratic Governors Association. And the DGA, when they sent out, they clearly labeled it as such. I mean, it's the notice has come out from them.
That's fascinating.
But they did mention that this is, this is an affiliate member of the DGA. The other thing that struck me as interesting is when you look at whether or not Ben Jealous is gaining any traction in Maryland is, when we had in August before Labor Day a very liberal, almost progressive, nationally known blog that came out and moved the Maryland race from lean Republican to likely Republican on the same day that Larry Sabato moved it to
Right.
likely Republican. That to me was an indication that Maryland perhaps was not going to be a player sort of in terms of the national money.
They just don't want to spend their money here. There are other races they would rather spend the money on.
And the Republican Governors Association, it's easy for them to spend their money here because if Hogan is that far up, and they're doing their own polling and they know what the numbers look like. It gives them a story in a blue wave year. It gives them a story in blue, in allegedly blue Maryland, which may some days be more purple than blue. They can point to Larry Hogan and say, look, Republican and blue Maryland won.
It's going to be their victory.
And that if he does win, that is likely to be part of the national narrative for the Republican
Because
Party.
they're likely to hold the Senate, maybe even gain a seat or so. They lose the House, but if they gain a seat or two in the Senate, have one of these high-profile governorships they can point to, it changes the narrative from blue wave to more of a split decision.
Right.
And when they were making those decisions over the summer to spend this money, that is not what it was looking like. So during the enthusiasm gap between Republicans and Democrats have persistently closed over time, particularly in the post-Kavanaugh era. But when we're talking about the initial $1 million investment from the Republican Governors Association that happened in June through August, that was the narrative that the Democrats might retake the House and the Senate. And so you're right. Like, they wanted a good story, and Charlie Baker in Massachusetts and Larry Hogan in Maryland was going to be their positive stories. Things have gotten, the fortunes for Republicans have gotten a little bit better, certainly, in the last month. But still, I mean, what's interesting about that is to think about, and this is thinking way past the next election cycle, is do they look at him as a future leader of the party? And
Right, it's a great question.
And we won't, that's speculation season.
It'll be some time until we know. We don't even know quite what 2020 is going to
No.
look like. Other questions?
Oh, sorry, no.
Oh, over here first and then I'll come over.
Two things I want to know what you guys think the impact is on the race. So I know Hogan at the beginning of the race, after the primaries, I think he put out an app.
Ah.
Oh, yeah.
The Larry Hogan app, yeah.
So I don't know much about it, but I was wondering if you thought that was like a good idea. And then also, I know in my family, a lot of things we talk about are his father.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Like his father, how big he was in the state. So any comments?
So I wrote a little bit about the app when it first came out, and because one of the things that fascinates me is Larry Hogan's and his campaign's interest in technologies and sort of finding ways to leverage them. And one of the things that in looking at it, it's designed to get users to come back. It provides sort of a reward for coming back where you can earn points that you can trade in for Larry Hogan's swag. If you want a T-shirt, that kind of a thing. For recommending people to join the app, you get points. It keeps score. You can run your score up on your friends. It's sort of meant to drive user interest, but it also gives the campaign a direct way to reach out to lots of people. I mean, they can send out messages now that say, hey, did you vote? I mean, one of the questions that I asked them that they did not answer that I think is not out of the realm of possibility is because when you sign up for the app, and I signed up for the app to see how it worked when I wrote about it, and I don't think I've gone in and looked at it since. One of the things that it does is it asks you for the ability to see where you're located. I think in a very sophisticated campaign, knowing what we know, the ability to see that you've got precincts that are favorable Hogan precincts where you've got people where the voting, like, they don't know, for example, that you voted, but they know that you live in a precinct that they're interested in. They can send push notifications reminding you to get out and vote. That can be done almost automatically. They don't even have to have a person sitting at a computer because they can set it up to do it. And that is much more effective than having to have somebody go out and knock on a door in a neighborhood or phone bank, when you can literally say, set up a program to look at the numbers every day in precincts and then be able to ping phones and remind people to not only get out and vote, but to, take the guy next to you, make sure he gets out and votes. And, I don't know for a fact that that's how they're using it, but I can't discount that there are the possibilities of that. But it does give them a direct channel to every person that has that app to send out a message and have direct communications in a way that is much more efficient than just the traditional phone banking.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think the issue of Larry Hogan's father, from Prince George's County, it's the 5th Congressional District. The seat that currently is held by Steny Hoyer is the seat that his father held. His father was one of the first Republican members of Congress to speak out against Richard Nixon. So his father really bolsters the image of Larry Hogan as being something separate from the National Republican mold. And in fact, whenever he voted in 2016, I believe he wrote his father's name in.
He said he wrote his father's name.
He voted for his father instead of for President Trump. I think if you have been a part of Maryland for a very long time, yes, that name means something to you. And it means something beyond, cookie cutter, generic Republican. And I think that certainly has helped him because he's very much continued in the tradition of his father. That doesn't necessarily always happen. I'd say he's a Republican cut from the same cloth. And that type of Republican is really more of the New England George H.W. Bush Republican, as opposed to the more Southern style Republican that tends to dominate the party right now. I think that's absolutely helped him, that father connection. You had a question over here?
Yep. So, a few weeks ago, we've seen some upticks in the numbers for the Attorney General's race, specifically with Craig Wolf, seeing within a 10-point margin, which, we've hinted at a few times here, that Maryland may not have this blue wave, but it doesn't look like we're going to have, a purple wave, if we're going to call it that. So, what do you guys think of the 10-point margin gap that we see now with the Attorney General's race?
Listen, that was a narrowing that I did not expect to see from Gonzalez's poll to our poll. So we were the ones who came in September that found exactly what I think you would have expected, that that Wolf was down significantly by Attorney General Bryan Frosch, and then a few weeks later, it comes out that they've narrowed the gap, that he's narrowed the gap, I think, significantly. I'm not sure if he'll be able to put it over the finish line or actually bring it in more than it is now. Mostly because while Democrats, I think, have separated the president from the governor, I think that a lot of Democrats in the state look to Bryan Frosch as sort of a champion of the resistance, right? So Democrats don't like the president. I mentioned it before. They don't like the president. And Bryan Frosch, I think, has been the most visible sort of natural enemy among Democrats in the state to push back. And I'm wondering if that is just enough to push will keep Wolf from, touching him. So Wolf has been, I think, consistent. He has a really clear message, right? A clear message that resonates, like crime, not Trump. I believe that's it. It's something like that. It rhymes. He's like, it's a rhyming message. Doesn't it rhyme? I'm missing, I don't know. It's something in crime and not Trump or something like that. I think that does resonate with a lot of people, but I'm not sure. But I think a lot of Democrats appreciate the fact that the Attorney General has taken an activist role against the president. One in which is interesting, they don't really expect the governor to do.
I'm not in any way, what I'm about to say, it's not in any way meant to be taken as a criticism of Pat Gonzalez's numbers, because I am not criticizing them at all. And I think he would actually agree with this next statement. I think the problem with the number is that we don't know what the number means, because there were no additional questions in the poll. I don't think that anybody sort of anticipated that number was going to come up. And so really what you need is to sort of have the idea that, for whatever reason, either you sense that there's movement and you want to test it, or you want to ask some questions specifically because you're interested in that race more so than the governor's race. The problem is we don't know none of those additional questions were programmed into the poll, and so we can have no way of knowing what that number really means. And so in theory, that could be the low end of the margin of error, just by the way they tested it. I mean, that number could look very different. That same poll done a week later could look much higher, and both numbers still be within the margin of error and basically be showing the same race.
Yeah.
I just don't know that we can know what that number really means without asking those other questions.
Right, I think the fascinating aspect is we are getting, to some extent, inconsistent polling of the races other than governor, because there is sort of the assumption that Cardin will win the Senate seat statewide. Everybody knows Franchot will win the comptroller's race, and the attorney general's race wasn't seen as something that was on the radar.
That's your stone cold lock for 2018.
My stone cold lock for this election, the one prediction I will make is that Peter Franchot will win re-election. You can write it down, take it to the bank. So we haven't been consistently polling the other races, so that number showed up, and it's like, wow, that's surprising. Now, some of it I think it makes sense because Wolf has actually been running a very effective campaign. The General Assembly, in part of their pushback against Trump, empowered the Attorney General to, on his own right, initiate challenges against the Trump administration. There may be some traction gained from this idea, well, you're our Attorney General, focus on Maryland, not on these fights with Trump over the emoluments clause and what have you. That being said, I think it would take much more than that to break the built-in advantages that Democrats have statewide. With Hogan, you've got an incumbent, well-known commodity running for re-election. The other Republicans, be they challenging Cardin or Franchot or Frosch, are just less well-known, less well-financed, and face a much, much steeper hill to overcome.
I'm just laughing because I think that Peter Franchot will not be satisfied unless he gets the most votes out of anybody in this. So he's running these. He started running ads, and I was like, running ads, okay, sure. But I think that is his goal, to have the most votes of anybody in this election cycle.
You're quoting Louis Goldstein. I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard Louis say that.
He wants the most votes?
Absolutely.
Well, and I think at the moment, Peter Franchot has received more votes statewide than any other candidate other than a candidate for president, because the turnout seems to be higher. He's the comptroller of the state, which most states don't have a comptroller, let alone elect a comptroller.
Right.
Maryland does. And
here's what I wanted your thought on. Because this gentleman raised an interesting possibility here that there would be a top-tier constitutional officer's coattail. In other words, since Franchot's already in the camp, could Hogan bring along the Attorney General race into a much tighter contest than it is right now?
I think there's no doubt that the Hogan endorsement is helping Craig Wolf. I think it just, the question is it really enough to, I mean, that's a heavy lift. It honestly is, because I think we polled on Attorney General Frosch before, particularly among Democrats. He's a pretty strong approval rating. He's certainly above water. That's a heavy lift. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying it's just that would be some significant coattails.
There's no tradition for televised Attorney General debates, which minimizes sort of even the voters' exposure to it. Yeah. But I think that will be a much tighter race than anybody expected, and that likely will be from a Hogan effect. He will have some coattails in that respect. You had a hand up consistently.
No, that's okay. I was actually curious about the comptroller's race and Peter Franchot.
Haven't we already decided the comptroller's race?
Franchot by a whisker.
I heard your comment, but I wondered if you would speak about, in reference to the Charles County race and some of the other races on the Eastern Shore, where some of our more established Democratic, particularly senators, lost the primary seats, and their allegation that Peter Franchot was behind some of that. I wondered if you could clarify that or speak to that, or.
I don't know that I could clarify that. I mean, there are. So, for example, the Charles County race, the Mac Middleton race, I don't think that there's any way that you could tie what happened there to Peter Franchot. That really had to do with with some of the more progressive unions like SEIU, and to a large extent some demographic shifts that we've been seeing, in that county that have, are now sort of showing, that they're going to start muscling the politics down there. I just don't think I don't think that there's necessarily any way to tie the comptroller to that. In terms of some of the other races, I mean, speaking generically, I mean, I'd probably have to know more about the particular individual races. To be honest with you, I think the comptroller has spent an enormous amount of time running the comptroller's race. With the exception of, for example, this ad that he's running about disrupting the machine, which in a lot of ways is part of his brand and really sort of focused on some very specific legislative leaders who I fully expect that I'll see back in Annapolis at the beginning of the session in January when I go down.
Yeah, I mean, his big target, he really would have liked to have seen Mike Miller lose in the primary. That was not going to happen.
Right.
I mean, there is a battle between the leadership in Annapolis and Peter Franchot. They don't like the fact that he sort of goes his own way. They don't like the fact that he's allied with the governor. They punished him by taking away some power from the Board of Public Works, which created a whole new political dynamic for several members of the Senate running for re-election, Matthias, Klausmeier, who helped sustain that veto and now are facing pretty solid headwinds. But
he has always had an uncomfortable relationship with the presiding officers going back to when he got elected comptroller. I've written a number of times about sort of these back and forth letters between him and the presiding officers, or the year that he came out against slots and Mike Miller had the budget committee cut out the PIN number for his for his now chief of staff, and it later got put back in. But there's always this level of message sending, and they sort of don't. It's well known that they don't get along.
yeah, there's no love lost.
And so a lot of like this ad that's running, this disrupt the machine ad with the cyborgs marching in lockstep, and the very dire picture of Mike Miller which sort of evokes this 1984-esque kind of thing. I mean, that's probably more about Peter Franchot's brand. And how he sees himself as a party maverick, I think, than any of the down ballot races.
I can just remember how gleeful he looked at the end of session when SEIU was doing the Take a Hike Mike.
Which he showed up for.
I think the Daily Record got this picture of him there. He just looks gleeful at that event. Listen, I think we'll go back and look. He's an interesting character in Maryland politics, most certainly.
Yeah, it's another person who sort of has gone beyond what the party is. Peter Franchot is a brand in and of himself.
Yeah.
We got a question over here? Yeah, please.
I've gone and knocked a few doors this election cycle.
Oh, good.
And I'm telling you that I don't see people in St. Mary's County getting in a truck. It's amazing.
Sure.
And I've gone to, these are hard Democrats. I've walked unaffiliated and soft Republicans. They're ugly lists for me to walk. And when you asked them, one of the questions was, where does the president stand with you, basically? And what I almost consistently heard was, I am not happy with the way he messages himself, but I'm not going to argue with the results. I am happy where we are result-wise. And I was really surprised, because I was thinking I was going to hear what you guys are saying here.
Sure.
But I don't hear it when I knock on the doors.
So-
I also hear that the number one concern is still taxes,
Yeah.
Yeah,
opioids,
Yeah.
and school safety.
school safety, opioids, taxes.
So these are things that our attorney generals ignore by going after, going after the federal government. So, and I believe, I heard Wolf tell us the other day that the attorney general has actually admitted that he's not doing the job he's elected to do.
So there are two things that you said that sound contradictory, but absolutely exist in the same universe together. And you said you talked to Democrats down here in St. Mary's County that are not necessarily upset with Trump and they're okay with the result. But also polls like Mileah's and the Washington Post and Pat Gonzalez's polls, which show that President Donald Trump is overwhelmingly disliked by the.
It takes an engagement with the voter on the spot.
Well, let me sort of explain. So I grew up in Eastern Baltimore County, a very blue collar area. My dad was a third shift paint room guy at Broning Highway. My friends' dads worked at the steel mill, which is now no longer even there. And these were areas that were very, very Democrat. And what we saw happen in 2014 in advance of the 2016 election, and Todd and I have talked about Dundalk being a little bit of a canary in a coal mine for 2016, which was you had these Democrats who had staunchly voted Democrat, had been told all their lives by the Democratic Party that they would be taken care of. They wanted the return of the steel mill. They wanted the return of these jobs that would help them pay for their houses and send their kids to college, and all of the American dream that they bought into. And those things didn't come back, and they got angry, and you saw a lot of those voters voting for Donald Trump in 2016, not just in Maryland, where, in Dundalk, for example, in 2014, you saw the state Senate, the 3 legislative seats in the House of Delegates, and the county council seat all roll from D to R in one election cycle, and then vote for Donald Trump in 2016, along with Rust Belt areas in Pennsylvania, in the South, in the Midwest, in places like Wisconsin and Michigan. And so there is sort of this duality of Democrats in Maryland who the majority very clearly does not like Donald Trump, but there are these pockets of Democrats who are, as I described it, as you've talked to, who may not necessarily like the way he comports himself, but are angry and are okay with the results.
I got a real fast question for Dr. Eberly.
Sure.
You spoke at the Lincoln Dinner a few years ago, and your prediction was if Donald Trump won the presidency, then Larry Hogan would be a one-term governor.
Yep.
So I'm asking you directly today, is that still your thought?
No, it's not. And I'll give you the reasoning. My assumption was typically you see in a midterm election, there's a counter to the presidential election, there's some pushback. So I envisioned if Hillary Clinton had won, the midterms would be very, very good for Republicans, and in an otherwise blue state, that would help a Republican governor win a re-election. But if Republicans won, there would be a Democratic pushback in the midterms, and in an overwhelmingly Democratic state, this would be bad for a Republican incumbent. What, of course, has happened in the interim is that Larry Hogan has fundamentally defined himself as Larry Hogan. He has risen above that party label that would otherwise harm him in what could be a very strong Democratic year. He's inoculated himself, almost, if you will. I'm not going to make a prediction because I predicted that Donald Trump wouldn't win, and of course he did. But it is very hard for me to imagine that all of the surveys that have been done in Maryland, and we're getting much more surveys than we used to get in this state.
You're welcome.
All show a 17 to a 22-point lead are wrong, and that they're missing this secret well of voters out there that are going to show up and change the outcome. Now, that doesn't mean I think there's going to be a 17 to 22-point margin on election day, but it's hard for me to imagine that those polls are just all completely wrong.
And I'll follow up by saying this. I wrote about this last year in the Baltimore Sun about this time last year, is that what I think a lot of people didn't expect is the way the Trump effect would actually work on the Maryland voter. And I think there is a Trump effect. It's just not what we expected. Every time Donald Trump tweets, and so what you're talking about is people don't like the delivery. And you're absolutely right. And as a matter of fact, that delivery really presents a juxtaposition between Larry Hogan and the president. And it has made Larry Hogan look more moderate in the eyes of voters. And it doesn't matter for Republicans. You guys are already solidly behind the governor. But it matters for independents, and it matters greatly for Democrats. They're comfortable with voting for a moderate Republican. They would not be comfortable in the time of Trump voting for a conservative Republican. And Donald Trump has worked because he's been persistently in the media, constant coverage over the last 2 years I think that it has allowed Larry Hogan to put himself visually against the president. Even when he's not pushing back directly, he presents an alternative type of Republican, a non-Trump Republican, and I think Democrats have rewarded him for it.
I think the Baltimore Sun endorsement of Trump actually, the Baltimore Sun endorsement of Hogan captured that perfectly when they said that, yeah, you could send a message by voting Democrat, but you can actually also send a very powerful message to the president by electing a different kind of Republican, which is what Larry Hogan is. And I thought that was actually a pretty compelling case that the Baltimore Sun made in an editorial that a lot of folks weren't expecting. The Baltimore Sun does not endorse Republican candidates for governor often. I think you got to go back to 1966 when the Democratic nominee was a segregationist. And the Baltimore Sun endorsed, of all people, Spiro Agnew, who at the time was viewed as the moderate, responsible alternative. And he was until he became vice president.
And I think there's another thing that's in that editorial endorsement that really sort of speaks to what you talked about, and what I think a lot of us still believe is that, you know, the economy and the taxes and the pocketbook issues are still very important, and that editorial actually goes off and mentions, you know, that Ben Jealous has proposed a lot of things, but they are concerned about the price tags of
Right.
them. And,
Very expensive.
And while they don't sort of elaborate on that, I mean, to me, the subtext of that was, you know, pocketbook election.
Okay, well, we've reached the end of this.
Oh.
So I'd just like to ask each of you, if you could just give me a closing thoughts, what you're looking at over the course of the next 2 weeks as we get to the point of the election.
I think for me, and probably I'll steal a little bit of Mileah's thunder, I think we're going to be looking a lot at the voter turnout, especially in early voting. And I'm going to be watching some of these districts that are the Drive for 5 districts. Plus, Baltimore County is extremely important in this election. It has been responsible for the outcome of the governor's race at least since 2002 when I started covering, and Baltimore County, you know, if I had the whiteboard, it would be Baltimore County, Baltimore County, Baltimore County, because I think that's, you know, Ben Jealous can become governor without winning Baltimore County. Larry Hogan cannot become governor without winning Baltimore County. It is the largest, in terms of the number of Republican voters, it's the largest population of Republican voters that he can reach, and it's extremely important. And if he does very well in Baltimore County, it bodes very well for the rest of his evening on election night.
Okay.
You know, I guess one of the things I'm looking at the most is how much money, if any money, gets dumped into the state from people like the Democratic Governors Association or outside progressive groups in the last week. I'm fundamentally curious to see if that spending actually ever comes to fruition. And I'm also interested to see how Larry Hogan decides to message himself in these final 2 weeks. And if he does end up winning, if that sort of messaging then becomes indicative of the way he'll be governing in a second term. One of the things I guess that I felt like from progressives, that an interesting attack line they use is this idea that Governor Hogan will be Chris Christie in his second term. That's the governor of New Jersey. And I don't really think that's true. I think that moderation is his only path. But I'll be interested in the last 2 weeks if he continues to message himself as a pragmatic moderate who's independent from the Republican Party. And you always have to watch the White House to see if anything comes, and if he mentions Larry Hogan, I'm sure there was that minute that where he mentioned Ben Jealous specifically at a rally, and Democrats were very excited about it. They tried to use it as a talking point. I have to wonder that the Hogan campaign is just like waiting with bated breath. Just please continue to ignore us for the rest of the time so we can get across the finish line.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's in many respects probably the Hogan campaign's nightmare is
Sure.
that the president decides to pick a fight with Ben Jealous and suddenly
Yes.
the race becomes nationalized. Because so far, Marylanders have been very clear. They've compartmentalized this election.
Yep.
Ben Cardin is their pushback against Donald Trump. Larry Hogan is the governor of Maryland, and that's a vote for Maryland. And they've separated those. If Trump were to engage with Jealous, that could potentially change that. Trump hasn't. He's been focused elsewhere on other things. So among the things I'm looking at, obviously it's the turnout. Turnout was ridiculously low in 2014. Absolutely turnout is going to be higher this time around. So
Sure.
seeing that early voting numbers are high, that absentee requests are high doesn't surprise me because 2014 was so low. Of course the numbers are going to be high. I'm going to use my famous line that early voting doesn't necessarily point to higher turnout. Early voting has traditionally simply cannibalized same-day voters. There's been no increase in turnout in Maryland associated with early voting. It's just a convenience factor. So, I mean, that's not a bad thing, but that's the reality. But I really want to see Montgomery County.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Montgomery County, to me, is actually the key here. Larry Hogan won, I believe it was 38% in Montgomery County 4 years ago. Did no better. Actually, I think he did worse than Bob Eberly did in Montgomery County. Larry Hogan has a very real possibility of scoring into the mid-40s in Montgomery County. If he tops 40% in Montgomery County, game over. So I'm paying attention to Montgomery County, and the thing about Montgomery County is they have a county executive race that's actually a contest because the progressive candidate, Elrich, won the nomination, and Nancy Florine, a Democrat, decided to run as an independent from the center. Unaffiliated, conservative, and Republican voters, to the extent they exist in Montgomery County, have a reason to come out and vote, and that could help Larry Hogan's numbers, and it could actually help Florine as well.
I'm sorry, Todd, I can no longer look at reports of early voting without thinking about cannibals. And usually people get so excited on Twitter, like, look at all these lines for voting. And I'm like, I just cannibalizing.
You're just cannibalizing
you ruined
same-day
it.
voting.
You ruined
It's-
the excitement
Yeah,
for me.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
Well,
That's
it's
my,
okay.
my life as a professor of public policy is to ruin everyone's excitement. I do it on a daily basis.
Terrible.
All right, so thank you for coming. Those of you who are actually in the audience, thank you to those who joined us via Facebook Live. And thanks to those who joined us online on behalf of the Center for the Study of Democracy at St. Mary's College. Thank you, Bryan Sears. Thank you, Mileah Kromer, for coming
you so
down
much.
and recording this with us. Thank you all.